CD 2. The Treasure of Monte Cristo. Continued.
Chapter 8. The 100 Days. Noirtier's words were true. Napoleon returned to Paris on 20th March, and the people of France welcomed him. King Louis XVIII tried to stop this happening, but he had to leave his country. And so Napoleon became Emperor of France for 100 days. Although Villefort had been loyal to the king, Noirtier told Napoleon good things about his son. Villefort kept his position in Marseille, but he could not marry Renée de Saint-Méran. While Napoleon was emperor, Villefort needed Bonapartist friends to help him. The family of Saint-Méran were loyal supporters of Louis XVIII, but if Louis returned in the future, then Villefort would need Marquis de Saint-Méran again. If this happened, Villefort would marry Renée de Saint-Méran. The marriage would improve his career. One morning, Morel the shipowner came to see Villefort. "Sir," said Morel, "you remember that I visited you 6 weeks ago, before Emperor Napoleon returned to France. I spoke to you about a young man who was the first officer on my ship, the Pharaon. His name was Edmond Dantes. Dantes was arrested because he carried a letter from Napoleon on Elba. In February that was a crime, but it would not be a crime today. At that time you served the king and couldn't help Dantes. Today you serve Napoleon. So I'm here to ask you this. What has happened to Edmond Dantes?" "Dantes," said Villefort slowly. "Edmond Dantes." He opened a large book and turned the pages. At last he looked up at Morel. "Are you sure that you have the right name, sir?" "Yes," said Morel. "I've known Dantes for 10 years. Don't you remember? I asked you to help him. You spoke to me coldly. You said, 'I'll find out if he is a traitor or not.' You were a loyal supporter of the king. You didn't want to help Bonapartists at that time." "Sir," said Villefort, "I did support King Louis then. I believed that the people wanted him to rule France. When Napoleon returned, I saw how his people loved him and hated Louis XVIII. I believe that the true king is the person who is loved by his people." "That's right," said Morel. "And so Edmond—" "Wait," said Villefort, turning the pages of his book. "Here is his name, Dantes, a sailor who was going to marry a young Catalan girl. I remember now. Dantes was accused of treason, a serious crime. I made my report to Paris. He was taken away a week later." "Where has he gone?" asked Morel. "Oh, he was taken to Fenestrelle prison on the Sainte Marguerite Islands. He'll return one day." "But why isn't he here now?" asked Morel. "Napoleon's officials should let him go free." "You must write to the Minister of Prisons," said Villefort. "But the minister receives hundreds of letters every day," said Morel. "He only answers 3 or 4. "That is true," said Villefort. "But he'll answer a letter that is signed by you and me. I'll deliver it." Villefort signed Morel's letter. Then he said, "I'll send this for you." But Villefort did not send the letter to Paris. He kept it. He hoped that one day Louis would be king again. Twice during the 100 days, Morel came to ask about Dantes, and twice Villefort promised that he would help Dantes, and then he sent Morel away. On 18th June 1815, after 100 days had passed, Louis became king again. Morel did not visit Villefort again. Soon after Louis returned to France, Villefort married Renée Saint-Méran, and they went to live in Toulouse. 3 months after Edmond's arrest, old Louis Dantès became ill and died. Danglars went to Madrid. He did not want to be a sailor anymore. Fernand and Caderousse became soldiers in the army. Mercédès walked through the streets of Les Catalans and wept. She did not want to live without Dantès. She often stood and looked at the sea. Sometimes she thought about killing herself. She thought about jumping into the sea, but she did not. Edmond Dantès remained in his dungeon at the Château d'If. Chapter 9. The Tunnel. It was now 1816. A year had passed since Louis XVIII had returned to Paris. An inspector of prisons came to visit the Château d'If. He met the prison's governor and then went to speak with several prisoners. Each prisoner said that the food was terrible and that they wanted to be free.
"Prisoners always say the same things," the inspector told the governor. "They all say, 'I'm innocent, I want to be free.' Are there any other prisoners to visit?"
"Only the dangerous and mad prisoners," replied the governor. "They're in the dungeons." The governor, the inspector and 2 soldiers went down the dark stairs to the dungeons. The cells were cold, wet, and dirty. They smelled terrible. The men stopped in front of a small wooden door with the number 34 written on it. "Who's in here?" said the inspector, holding his hand over his nose.
"Prisoner number 34, a very dangerous man," said the governor. "When he arrived, he tried to kill the jailer."
"That's true," said the jailer. "He must be mad," said the inspector. "He'll be mad in another year," said the jailer. "He's almost mad now."
"There's another cell about 20 metres away," said the governor. "The prisoner in that cell is a mad priest. He's been here since 1811. He went mad in 1813. "I'll speak to both of them," said the inspector.
Dantès was sitting on the floor in the corner of his cell. The only furniture was a small bed, a chair, and a wooden table. On the table there was a jug of water and a plate. The young man's face was very pale, and he had a thick black beard on his face. Dantès only saw daylight for a few hours each day. The light came through a very small window, which was high in one wall. He jumped up to meet the inspector, but the soldiers pushed him away.
"What do you want?"
the inspector asked Dantès. Dantès tried to speak calmly. "I don't want them to think that I'm mad or dangerous," he thought. "Sir, why am I here?" he asked. "What is my crime? I want a fair trial in court."
"When were you arrested, prisoner number 34?
asked the inspector. "The 28th February, 1815, at 2:30 in the afternoon," said Dantès.
"Today is the 30th July, 1816, said the inspector. "You've only been here for 17 months.
He turned towards the governor and said,
"You must show me this prisoner's papers."
"Sir," said Dantès, "I know that you can't free me, but please help me to get a fair trial. Please give me some hope."
"I can't give you hope," said the inspector. "I can only find out about your arrest. Who arrested you?"
"The prosecutor of Marseille, Monsieur Villefort."
"Villefort left Marseille," said the inspector. "He now lives in Toulouse. Did he have any reason to be your enemy?
No, he was very kind to me, said Dantes.
Then can I believe what he writes about you? Asked the inspector.
Yes, sir, said Dantes. Later, the inspector looked at Dantes' papers. He also read Villefort's report about prisoner number 34. Edmond Dantes, a dangerous Bonapartist. He helped Napoleon to return from the island of Elba. Put him in a cell alone. Watch him very carefully. After he had read this, the inspector wrote the words, "Do nothing." Weeks, months, and years passed. Dantes was now 25 years old. He was very thin and very dirty. His clothes were torn, and his hair and beard were long. He had hoped and prayed to be free, but this did not happen. One day he looked at his supper. There were a few pieces of bad meat and the small piece of dry bread on his plate. He was already extremely hungry, but he did not eat. "From today," he said, "I'll throw my food out of the window. If I don't eat, I'll die. Then my terrible life here will end." But one evening, Dantes heard a noise in the wall of his cell. Knock, knock, knock. He heard the knocking sound for nearly 3 hours. Then it stopped. What had made this sound? Several hours later, the knocking began again. It was nearer now. Suddenly, the jailer came into the cell and gave Dantes his breakfast. Dantes quickly began to talk. He spoke louder and louder. He was afraid that the jailer would hear the knocking in the wall. But after a minute, the jailer left. He thought that Dantes was mad. The noise continued, and it became louder. "It's another prisoner," thought Dantes. "Is he trying to make a tunnel so that he can escape? Or is someone working in the next cell?" He picked up his plate and knocked it against the wall. Immediately, the sound in the wall stopped. Dantes waited. If the knocking starts again, it will be a workman, he thought. But if a prisoner is making the noise, my knock will frighten him. He'll wait until everyone is asleep before he hits the wall of his cell again. There was silence. The noise did not begin again. 3 days later, Dantes heard sounds again. Was someone digging a tunnel? He had to help. Dantes looked at the stones in the wall of his cell. If he dug out the cement which was around the stones, he could remove them. But he needed tools. What could he use? Then he had an idea. He picked up his water jug from the table and dropped it on the stone floor. The jug broke into several pieces. Dantes took 2 or 3 of the sharpest pieces and hid them in his bed. When the jailer came again, Dantes spoke to him. "I dropped the water jug when I was drinking." The jailer was angry. "Be more careful," he said. He brought Dantes another jug, but he did not take away the broken pieces. After the jailer left, Dantes began to work on the wall. A broken piece of the jug was a good tool. He began to work on the wall behind his bed. Near the floor of the cell, the cement between the stones was old and soft. Dantes could dig out the cement easily. After many hours, Dantes had dug out the cement from a few of the smaller stones. These stones were now loose. Soon, he would be able to pull them out of the wall. Dantes worked for 3 days, but then he came to a very large stone that would not move. He could not move it with his fingers, and the sharp pieces of the jug had broken. He needed another tool. Dantes sat and thought. At last, he had an idea. The jailer always brought food in a metal pot and put some of it onto Dantes' plate. That evening, Dantes put his plate on the floor close to the door. When the jailer came into the cell, he stepped on the plate and broke it. Now Dantes could not have any food. "Please, will you leave the pot?" said Dantes. "You can take it away when you bring my breakfast." "All right," said the jailer. He did not want to come back with another plate. Dantes ate his food. Then he used the handle of the pot to dig out the cement around the large stone. After an hour, the stone came out of the wall. Now there was a large hole behind Dantes' bed. Hour after hour, Dantes continued his work. He was digging further into the thick wall. He was slowly making a tunnel. He worked until early the next morning. Before the jailer brought his breakfast, Dantes put the stone back into the wall and put his bed in front of it. "Did you bring me another plate?" Dantes asked the jailer. "No," the jailer replied. "You break everything. You can keep the pot. I'll put your food into it." Dantes said a prayer and thanked God for his good luck. Now he could use the handle of the pot to dig his tunnel. When the jailer had gone, Dantes began to work on his tunnel again. He worked all day. Soon the hole was big enough for a man to climb inside it. Dantes listened for sounds from the next cell, but there was silence. Perhaps the prisoner in the next cell did not trust him. After he ate his supper, Dantes worked for 2 or 3 hours. Suddenly he came to a thick piece of wood. "Dear God!" cried Dantes. "Don't let me die here! Must I lose all hope?" "Who talks of God and losing hope at the same time?" said a voice. It seemed to come from under the ground. "An unhappy prisoner," replied Dantes. "What is your name?" said the voice. "Edmond Dantes." "How long have you been here, Edmond Dantes?" "Since the 28th February, 1815, said Dantes. "What was your crime?" "I did something which helped Napoleon to return to France," said Dantes. "I carried a message from him when he was exiled to the island of Elba in 1814. "He was exiled?" said the man's voice. "Yes," replied Dantes. "Didn't you know?" "I've been here since 1811, said the prisoner. "Where have you been digging, Dantes? Where is your tunnel?" "It's near the floor of my cell," replied Dantes. "How do you hide the hole in the wall of your cell?" "I put a large stone in the entrance of the hole. Then I put my bed in front of it," said Dantes. "What's outside the door of your cell?" asked the prisoner. "A passage which leads to a courtyard," Dantes said. "Oh," cried the prisoner. "What's wrong?" asked Dantes. I've dug my tunnel in the wrong direction," said the prisoner. "I've made a mistake of nearly 5 meters. I thought that your wall was the outside wall of the prison." "But then the end of your tunnel would have been above the sea," said Dantes. "I was going to jump into the sea and swim to one of the islands near here," replied the prisoner. "Can you swim as far as the islands?" asked Dantes. "God will give me the strength," the prisoner replied. "Who are you?" asked Dantes. "I'm prisoner number 27, said the voice. "How old are you?" "I was 19 when I was arrested. I'm almost 26 now." "We'll talk again soon," said number 27. "Wait until I call you." Dantes climbed back along his tunnel and into his cell. He was a happy man. He was not alone. He had a friend. Next morning, Dantes heard 3 knocks on the wall. He quickly moved his bed and went down onto his knees. He put his head down near the floor of the cell. "Is that you, number 27? Dantes said. "I'm here."
"Has your jailer brought your breakfast this morning?" asked the prisoner.
"Yes," said Dantes. "He won't return until this evening."
"Then I can work,"
said number 27. After about an hour, part of the floor under Dantes fell away. He moved back quickly when small stones and earth disappeared into the hole. Then the head, shoulders, arms and body of a man appeared in the floor of Dantes' cell. Chapter 10. Faria. The man who climbed up into Dantes' cell was small and old. He had long grey hair, a thin face, and a long brown and grey beard. He thanked Dantes for his welcome. Then he looked at the hole behind Dantes' bed.
"You removed the stones," he said, "but you didn't have the right tools to help you."
"No," said Dantes. He was surprised. "What tools do you have?"
"I took pieces of metal from my bed and made many tools," said the old man. "I dug 15 or 16 meters to get here. I thought that I was going to the outside wall of the prison. I was going to jump into the sea."
"Who are you?" asked Dantes. "What is your name?"
"I'm a priest," said the old man. "My name is Faria. I came to the Chateau d'If in 1811. Before that, I was in the fortress of Fenestrelle for 3 years.
"Why are you here, sir?"
In 1807, said Faria, I spoke against the governments who ruled the regions of Italy. I thought that one king should rule all of Italy. But powerful men heard about my political opinions, and I was put in prison. My plans failed, and now my tunnel hasn't been successful."
Then Faria began to talk about some of the prisoners who had escaped from French prisons.
"Only a few prisoners escaped," he told Dantes. "Some men planned for many months to escape. Others waited for a lucky chance and then used it. Let's wait for our lucky chance, Dantes. Now, come and see my cell."
Dantes followed Faria through the tunnel. In one corner of the priest's cell there was an old fireplace. Faria lifted a stone which was in front of the fireplace. Some metal and wooden tools were hidden in this secret place. There were also several books. The pages of each book were covered with hundreds of lines of tiny words.
"I had 5,000 books in my library in Rome," Faria told Dantes. "Now I spend many hours remembering those books. And I write about my thoughts and about my life. I write them in these books."
The old man looked down at the tiny words in the pages of the small books. "But how did you write down your thoughts?" asked Dantes. "We're prisoners. We're not allowed to have pens, ink and paper."
"Sometimes they give us fish for our supper," said Faria. "I keep the bones of the fish and I make pens from them. And I make paper from pieces of my shirts. I take black soot from the old fireplace and some wine that the jailer brings me. I mix them together and make ink."
"You're a very clever man, Faria," said Dantes.
"Now, please tell me your story," said the old man.
Dantes told Faria everything that had happened on the ship Pharaon, and he told him about his wedding day. "Only one man in the crew didn't like me," he said. "His name was Danglars. He was the cargo master on the Pharaon."
"Was anyone with you during your last conversation with Captain Leclerc?"
asked Faria. "No, we were alone in the captain's cabin," said Dantès. "But wait, I remember now. When Captain Leclerc gave me the packet for Marshal Bertrand, Danglars went past the cabin door."
"Did you take anybody with you to the island of Elba?"
"Nobody," said Dantès.
"Bertrand took the packet, and then he gave you a letter," said Faria. "Is that right?"
"Yes," said Dantès. "I had the letter in my hand when I returned to the Pharaon."
"So Danglars probably saw the letter," said Faria.
"Yes, that's true," Dantès replied.
"You were arrested because of another letter," said Faria. "Do you remember what it said?"
"I remember every word," said Dantès. "The prosecutor showed it to me. It said, 'This letter is from a friend of the king. Edmond Dantès, the first officer of the ship Pharaon, is going to deliver a letter to friends of Napoleon in Paris. You will find proof of this crime when you arrest Dantès, or proof can be found at his father's house.'"
"Describe Danglars' handwriting," said Faria.
"Danglars made strong marks and he wrote quickly. He used a lot of ink," said Dantès. But the handwriting in the letter from Elba was weak. The words were badly written."
"The writer of the letter disguised his writing," said Faria.
"And you think Danglars wrote the letter?" asked Dantès.
"Yes, I do," answered Faria. "Did anyone want to stop your marriage to Mercédès?"
"There was a young Catalan who loved her," replied Dantès. "His name was Fernand."
"Did Danglars know Fernand?"
"Yes, I saw them together at the café called La Réserve," said Dantès. "They were in the café on the evening before my wedding. There was a third person with them, a man named Caderousse. And wait, I remember now. There was a pen and some paper on the table in the café. I was arrested because of a false letter. Did Caderousse, Danglars and Fernand know about it? I think that they did. But why was I sent to prison without a trial?"
"That question is more difficult to answer," said Faria.
He thought for a moment or two.
"Did you tell the prosecutor of Marseille your whole story?"
"Yes, I did," said Dantès. "He read the letter from Elba, and he was very upset about my bad luck."
"Your bad luck?"
said Faria. "Yes," replied Dantès. "The prosecutor burned the letter. He said that he wanted to help me. The letter was the only proof against me. That is what he said."
"What name and address was on the letter?"
"Monsieur Noirtier, 13 Rue Coqueron, Paris."
"Noirtier," said Faria. "I knew a person with that name. What was the prosecutor's name?"
"Villefort," said Dantès. Faria laughed loudly.
"Did Prosecutor Villefort tell you never to speak the name Noirtier again?"
"Yes, he made me promise."
"That's because Noirtier was his father," said Faria. "The prosecutor's real name was Noirtier de Villefort. Danglars, Caderousse, Fernand, and then Villefort. They all betrayed you."
Dantès went back through the tunnel to his own cell. He sat and thought about his life. He did not want to kill himself now. He wanted to live. He wanted to escape and take revenge on his enemies. Faria promised that he would teach Dantès everything that he knew, and Dantes promised to help the old man to dig a new tunnel. 2 years passed. Dantes learnt many things from Faria. The old priest taught the young man Spanish, English, German, and Italian. They talked about philosophy, science, mathematics, poetry, and politics. They also began to dig a new tunnel. But the work ended suddenly when Faria became ill.
"I know what is wrong," said Faria. "I have brain fever. I've had the illness before. There's medicine in a small bottle under my bed. When I stop moving, and I'm cold like a dead man, open my mouth. Then you must pour 8 or 10 drops of the medicine into—"
The old man could not finish his sentence. His body began to shake. His face became red, and he cried out. He moved his arms and legs about wildly. Faria moved and cried out for 2 hours. Then he became still and cold. Dantes opened the old man's mouth and poured 10 drops of the medicine into it. Then he waited. The cell became dark. Night fell. At last, Faria sat up. He could not speak, but he pointed to the door and his plate. Dantes understood. He must leave Faria's cell immediately. The jailer was coming with their food. Dantes crawled back along the tunnel to his own cell. As soon as the jailer left the food, Dantes went back through the tunnel to Faria. The old man was able to speak now.
"I'll never leave Chateau d'If, Edmond," he said. "I can't walk, and I won't be able to swim."
"We can wait until you're strong again," said Dantes.
"My dear friend,"
said Faria.
"you're young and strong. Don't wait for me."
"I won't leave you while you're alive," said Dantes. The next morning, Faria was a little better. When the priest saw Dantes, he gave him a piece of half-burned paper with writing on it.
"This paper tells where my treasure is hidden," he said. "From this day, 1/2 of the treasure belongs to you."
"Your treasure?" said Dantes.
"Yes, I'll tell you about it," said the old man. "I was once a secretary, and I lived in Rome. My employer was Cardinal Spada. He was a priest, and he was the last member of an old Roman family. The cardinal was not a rich man himself, but his family were once rich. In the 15th century, the Spadas had to hide their riches because of a cruel and ambitious man called Cesare Borgia. Borgia and his father, Pope Alexander VI, were the most powerful men in Rome, and they wanted to control all of Italy. Borgia murdered people so that he could take their money and property. Borgia knew that the Spada family were rich, so he invited the head of the family, Count Cesare Spada, to dinner. Count Spada knew that Borgia was going to kill him. A few months before, Borgia had murdered 2 cardinals so that he could have their money and property. "Before Count Spada went to Borgia's house," said Faria, "he wrote a letter to his nephew, Guido. The letter told Guido where the Spada's riches were hidden, but when he arrived at Borgia's palace, Count Spada saw his nephew talking with Borgia. Guido was also a guest at the dinner. Borgia gave Guido and Count Spada food and wine that contained poison. Both men died that evening."
"What happened to the letter and the money?" asked Dantes.
"No one ever found the letter or the Spada's riches," said Faria. "Borgia took all of the family's papers and properties. He searched for many months, but he never found the letter and the treasure. Years passed," Faria went on. "Some Spadas became soldiers.
Others became bankers or priests. Some Spadas had money, but most of them were poor. The last member of the family, Cardinal Spada, was my employer. He also looked for the Spada's treasure. He searched almost until the day that he died, but he never found it. When he died, all of his papers and some money came to me. On 25th December, 1807, 2 weeks after the Cardinal's death, I was reading the papers for the 1000th time, said Faria. I fell asleep. When I woke, it was dark. I took a candle in one hand and found an old piece of paper. I wanted to light the candle, so I put the paper into the fire. I was going to carry a flame to the candle. Suddenly, I saw writing on the paper. The words were written in special ink, and the heat from the fire had made the words appear. I quickly pulled the paper out of the fire, but some of it was burned. It's the paper that you hold in your hand, Edmond. But half the words on each line are missing, said Dantes. Faria smiled. Then he gave Dantes another piece of paper with writing on it. These, I believe, are the missing words, he said. Put the two pieces together and read it. Dantes held the two pieces together and read these words. Today, Cesare Borgia invited me to dinner. I know that Borgia poisoned Cardinal Capra and Cardinal Bentivoglio and took their money and property. Now Borgia wants my property, money, and jewels too, but he will not get my treasure. I have hidden it in a secret place. After my death, I want my nephew, Guido Spada, to have all my money, gold, and jewels. The treasure is hidden on the island of Monte Cristo. Guido knows the hiding place. Go ashore where there is a little creek. Walk east until you see a line of rocks. Lift the 20th rock and find the entrance of 2 caves. The treasure is in the corner of the 2nd cave. Count Cesare Spada, 25th April, 1498. A month after I found the old piece of paper, I was arrested, Faria said. Did you write the words on this second piece of paper? Asked Dantes. I did, said Faria. I've thought and worked on these words for many years. If we escape together from here, half this treasure is yours. I give it to you. If I die here and you escape alone, all the treasure is yours. But the treasure belongs to you, said Dantes. I'm not a member of your family. I am a priest, said Faria. Priests cannot marry and have children. You are like a son to me now, Edmond. Chapter 11. Escape. Time passed. Faria did not know the island of Monte Cristo, but Dantes had often sailed past it. He told Faria about it. Monte Cristo was near an island called Pianosa, which was between Corsica and Elba. They talked about places where the treasure might be hidden. One night, Dantes woke up suddenly. Someone was calling him. He hurried through the tunnel to Faria's cell. The old man was sitting on the floor and holding the side of his bed. My dear friend, he whispered to Dantes, I am dying. I saved you once, said Dantes. I can save you again. Well, you can try, said Faria. But if I don't get better, pour all the medicine into my mouth this time. Dantes picked Faria up and put him on his bed. Then he went to the door of the cell to call for help. No, said Faria. If the jailer finds you here, you'll never leave the prison. Go back to your own cell. If you do escape, go to Monte Cristo. Find the treasure." Dantes held the old man's hand. "Goodbye, goodbye," said Faria. "Monte Cristo. Don't forget, Monte Cristo." The old man's head fell back, and his mouth opened. Dantes quickly poured 10 drops of the medicine into Faria's mouth. He waited. 10 minutes passed. Then half an hour. Faria did not move. Dantes poured the rest of the medicine into Faria's mouth. The old man's body began to shake, and he gave a short, sharp cry. He sat up in the bed, and then fell back suddenly. He was dead. Dantes stayed with Faria until the morning. When he heard the jailer coming with the breakfasts, he returned to his own cell. First, the jailer came with Dantes' breakfast. Then he went to Faria's cell. Dantes listened at the entrance to his tunnel. He heard the jailer go into Faria's cell. Then he heard him call for help. "He's found Faria's body," Dantes thought. Other men ran to Faria's cell. Then soldiers arrived. Finally, the governor came to the old man's cell. Dantes listened.
"The priest is dead,"
said the governor.
"Put him into a sack. We'll remove him this evening at 10 or 11 o'clock. Leave him now and lock his cell."
Dantes heard the men leave. After a moment, he crawled through the tunnel to Faria's cell. He saw the sack with Faria's body in it. Then he went and sat on the bed next to his dear friend. "If I could die, I would be with my old friend again," he said. "But I will not die now. I want to live and find happiness again. Perhaps I'll find Mercedes. There are people who betrayed me, and I want revenge. But what shall I do? Only dead people leave Chateau d'If." As he said this, Dantes had an idea. First, he went to the fireplace and took Faria's tools and a knife from the hiding place. Next, he opened the sack and removed Faria's body. Then he took the body to his own cell and put it on his bed. He covered Faria's body with a blanket and turned his head towards the wall. "When the jailer brings my supper," Dantes thought, "he'll see Faria's body, but he won't see his face. He'll think that I'm sleeping on the bed." Dantes returned to Faria's cell quickly. He took Faria's needle and some thread. Then he got inside the sack and sewed it up from the inside. This was Dantes' plan. After the jailers had buried him, Dantes would wait. When the jailers had left the graveyard, he would cut open the sack. He would push up the soft earth and escape. He hoped that he was strong enough to dig through the earth quickly. If he could not get to the air, he would die. Dantes lay in the sack and waited. After many hours, he heard someone open the cell door. 2 men picked up the sack and carried him out of the cell. "He's a thin old man, but he's heavy," said one jailer. After a few minutes, Dantes felt the cold night air. They were outside the prison. The jailers put the sack down on the ground. "Where am I?" thought Dantes. "Is this the graveyard?" "Lift the lamp," said the first man. "I can't see clearly. I can't here it is." Dantes felt the jailers put something heavy next to the sack. Then they tied some rope around his feet. "Have you tied the rope tightly to the stone?" asked the second man. "Yes," replied the first man. Then they picked up the sack and walked about 50 meters. Dantes heard the sea crashing against rocks below the fortress. "The weather is bad," said the first man. "It's not a nice night for a swim." The second man laughed. "Ha! Well, he won't be trying to swim," he said. 1, 2, 3. At that moment, Dantes felt himself flying through the air. Then he was falling. His body was pulled down by the heavy stone that was tied to his feet. Splash! He hit the ice-cold water. He gave a loud cry, and the water closed over his head. Dantes had been thrown into the sea. His grave was not in the earth. It was in the water. The sea was the graveyard of the Chateau d'If. Chapter 12. The Jeune Amélie. Dantes had to get up to the surface of the water. He must have air. He cut open the sack, but the heavy stone pulled him down deeper and deeper. Dantes pushed the knife down to his feet and cut the rope. Finally, the stone fell away and his feet were free. He kicked his legs. He must go up. He did not want to drown. He swam up until his head came out of the water. He took a big breath of air. Then he swam under the water again. He did not want the soldiers in the fortress to see him. When his head came out of the water for the second time, Dantes was 50 meters from the rocky shore. He listened. He did not hear shouts from the prison. No one had seen him escape. He began to swim away from the island. Soon he could no longer see the fortress. The sky became lighter. In a few hours the sun would rise. Rain began to fall, and a cold wind began to blow. Dantes swam for another hour. Suddenly, the sky became darker. At the same moment, he felt a sharp pain in his knee. He put his hand down and felt sharp rocks. He had reached the shore of an island. This must be Tiburon, thought Dantes. He knew that this small island was only a few kilometers from Chateau d'If. He pulled himself out of the water and walked a few meters onto the shore. Then he lay down and slept. After an hour, Dantes was woken by the sound of thunder. There was a terrible storm above him. Lightning flashed. The wind blew and rain fell heavily. Dantes opened his mouth and drank the rainwater. It was delicious. He turned towards the sea and looked at the sky and the waves. There was another flash of lightning, and Dantes saw a fishing boat. It was close to the island. Suddenly, a huge wave threw the boat against the rocks of the shore. There was a loud crash, and the wooden boat began to break. Dantes ran down to the rocks. The men in the boat fell into the sea. They saw Dantes and shouted, but he could not help them. All the men drowned. At last, the wind stopped blowing, and the sea became calm. When the sun rose, Dantes saw pieces of the fishing boat and a red fisherman's hat in the water. He looked towards Chateau d'If. In 2 or 3 hours, the jailer will find poor Faria's body in my cell, he thought. Then everyone in the fortress will begin to search for me. They'll search the sea around If, and they'll tell the police in Marseille about my escape. A few minutes later, Dantes saw the sails of a ship. He watched it come towards Tiburon. Suddenly, Dantes had an idea. He jumped into the sea, lifted the red hat out of the water, and put it on his head. Then he held a large piece of wood that had come from the fishing boat. He began to swim towards the sailing ship. When he was near the ship, Dantes took off the red hat and lifted it up in the air. "Help! Help!" he shouted. The sailors on the ship saw the red hat in Dantes' hand, and they heard his shouts. 2 sailors got into a small boat, lowered it from the ship, and began to row towards him. Dantes began to swim towards the small boat, but he was very tired. He could not swim any further. His head went under the surface of the water. He was going to drown. Suddenly, he felt someone put their hands under his arms. A few seconds later, the sailors had pulled him up out of the sea. Dantes lay in the bottom of the boat. His head fell back, his eyes closed, and he heard nothing more. He had fainted. When he opened his eyes again, Dantes was aboard the ship. It was sailing away from the Chateau d'If. Someone poured some rum into his mouth, and the strong drink made him feel better. A dark, heavy man came to speak to Dantes.
"You're on the ship Jeune Amélie," he said. "I am Captain Baldi. Who are you?"
Dantes did not want to tell the captain his name, or where he had come from. I'm a sailor," he answered. He spoke in Italian. "My home is on Malta. I was on a ship that sank in a storm last night. I was lucky. I fell into the sea and held on to a piece of wood. The captain of my ship and the rest of the crew drowned. Thank you for saving me."
"Look, what's happening at the Chateau d'If?" said one of the sailors.
He was pointing to the north. Dantes looked up. He saw a small white cloud above the chateau. A few seconds later, he heard a loud explosion. "A prisoner has escaped from the Chateau d'If," said Dantes. "The soldiers are firing the fortress's cannon." The captain looked quickly at Dantes. Dantes was very thin, and his face was pale. His hair and his beard were long, and all his clothes were old and torn.
"Perhaps this man escaped from the prison," thought Baldi. "I don't care. If he's a good sailor, he'll be useful to us." "Maltese," he said to Dantes, "do you know the Mediterranean well? Do you know the best places to anchor a ship?"
"Yes," Dantes replied. "I've been sailing on this sea since I was a young boy." The captain turned to one of the crew.
"Jacopo," he said, "give this man a shirt and a pair of trousers."
Jacopo went away and came back with one of his own shirts and a pair of trousers. He gave them to Dantes. "Thank you," said Dantes. "What is the date?" Jacopo was surprised.
"Why do you ask me this? Have you forgotten?"
I hurt my head when my ship sank," said Dantes. "I can't remember very much at all."
"It's 28th February, 1829, said Jacopo. "Come with me, Maltese. I'll get you some food."
14 years had passed since Dantes had been arrested and taken to the Chateau d'If. He was now 33 years old. Chapter 13. The Treasure. The crew of the Jeune Amélie were smugglers. At first, Captain Baldi suspected that Dantes was a customs officer, but very soon Baldi was happy with the Maltese. Everyone on the Jeune Amélie liked Dantes, and Jacopo the Corsican became his good friend. The captain saw that Dantes was a good sailor. He found out that Dantes knew many small islands where the smugglers could hide their ship. After this, Baldi asked no more questions, and he paid Dantes well. For 2 months, the Jeune Amélie sailed along the coasts of the countries around the Mediterranean. At last, they reached Leghorn in Italy. Dantes went ashore to find a barber. He asked the man to cut his long hair and shave his beard. When the barber had removed all of Dantes' beard with a sharp razor, Dantes looked in a mirror. He was surprised when he saw his face. He was thin, and there were many more lines around his sad eyes. My family and friends won't recognize me, he thought. I don't recognize myself. Next, he bought new clothes, a pair of white trousers, a shirt with blue and white stripes, and a hat. A few days later, the Jeune Amélie left Leghorn and sailed south. The ship was carrying a cargo of cigars, sherry, and wine. The smugglers were going to take these things to a secret place on the coast of Corsica. Another ship was going to smuggle the cargo to France. The next morning, Captain Baldi saw Dantès standing on the deck of the Jeune Amélie. The ship was passing the small island of Monte Cristo. Dantès was staring across the sea at the island. Every night for 3 months, Dantès had dreamed about the treasure on Monte Cristo. I could jump off the ship and swim to Monte Cristo in half an hour, he thought. But what would the crew say? What would Captain Baldi think? The smugglers suspect that I have a secret. I don't want them to follow me. No, I must wait. I'll return to the island alone. Dantès had waited 14 years for his freedom, and now he was free. He could wait another 6 months or a year for his treasure. But was there really any treasure? Or was it only poor Faria's dream? Of course there was Spada's letter. Dantès remembered every word of it. 2 months passed, and the Jeune Amélie returned to Leghorn. One evening, Captain Baldi took Dantès to an inn in the town. Dantès had visited the inn many years before. He knew that smugglers went there. Baldi thought that Dantès would soon leave the Jeune Amélie, but he wanted Dantès to stay and become a smuggler. He told Dantès his plan. The Jeune Amélie was going to meet a Turkish ship which carried a cargo of Turkish carpets and cloth from Kashmir. The two captains needed a secret place to meet. They were going to move the cargo from the Turkish ship to the Jeune Amélie. The smugglers did not want the customs officers to see this. "We'll use the island of Monte Cristo," said Baldi to the Turkish captain. "No customs officers will find us there. Take your cargo to the island and we'll collect it later." Dantès was very excited. This was his lucky chance. Now he could get to the island and find Faria's treasure. Several days later, the Jeune Amélie reached Monte Cristo. At 10 o'clock that night, the crew dropped the ship's anchor and the Jeune Amélie stopped near the shore. Dantès lowered a boat over the side of the ship and rowed towards the island. The Jeune Amélie's crew worked all through the night. They picked up the cargo which had been left by the Turkish smugglers. Then they loaded it onto the Jeune Amélie. In the morning, everyone rested on the soft sand of the shore, but Dantès did not rest. He told the smugglers that he was going to shoot one of the wild goats that lived on the island. "We'll have a good meal of goat meat when I return," he said. Then he took a gun and walked away from the shore. Jacopo called out, "I'll come with you!" Half an hour later, Dantès killed a small goat. "Take it back to the others," he told Jacopo. "They can cook it. When the meat is cooked, fire a gun and I'll return." Jacopo went back to the shore with the goat and Dantès walked further across the island. He climbed up to the top of a high rock and looked down at the shore. The smugglers were busy by the fire. Dantès remembered Count Spada's letter and the words that Faria had written. "Go ashore where there is a little creek. Walk east until you see a line of rocks. Lift the 20th rock and find the entrance of 2 caves. The treasure is in the corner of the 2nd cave." Dantès began to walk across the island. After more than an hour, he found a path between 2 walls of rock. He went down the path and onto the shore. As he walked beside the sea, Dantes looked at the rocks above the shore. He began to count them. 1, 2, 3. Each rock had small marks on them. Had a man made these marks? But the 20th rock had no marks on it. Perhaps I've made a mistake, Dantes thought. There is no cave here, only a very large rock. Perhaps I'm going in the wrong direction. I'll go back and start again. He walked back past the rocks and along the path. When the smugglers saw Dantes, the captain called to him.
"Maltese!" he shouted. "The meat is cooked!"
The men watched Dantes coming down to the shore. They saw him jumping from rock to rock. Suddenly, his foot slipped on the edge of a rock, and he fell. The men ran to help him. When they reached Dantes, he was lying on the ground. They tried to lift him, but Dantes cried out. "Stop!" he shouted. "I've injured my back. I can't move. Leave me. Go and eat your meal. Let me rest." Later, the smugglers tried to move Dantes again. Once more he cried out. His face was pale.
"Perhaps you've broken some of your ribs," said Baldi. "We'll stay here until this evening. We can try to move you then."
"No, you must return to the Jeune Amélie," said Dantes. "You must sell the cargo. Continue your journey. Leave me some bread and rum, and leave me some gunpowder for my gun and a pickaxe. I'll get better soon, I'm sure. Make a small fire for me here. I can shoot a goat and cook the meat on the fire, and I can use the pickaxe to build a shelter."
"Very well," said the captain. "We'll be away for a week. We'll come back for you in 7 days.
Jacopo wanted to stay with Dantes. "You're a good friend to me, Jacopo," said Dantes. "But you must go with the others."
"Very well, Maltese," said the Corsican. "Good luck."
An hour later, the Jeune Amélie sailed away from Monte Cristo. When he could not see the ship's sails, Dantes stood up. There was nothing wrong with him. He had no injuries. He smiled, picked up the gun and the pickaxe, and ran towards the big rock. When he reached it, he walked all around it. How did Spada lift this rock without any help, he said to himself. Of course, he didn't lift it, he pushed it down here. Dantes looked at the ground around the rock. Then he used his pickaxe to dig a small hole beside the rock. Next, he poured some gunpowder into the hole. He tore off a long piece of cloth from his shirt and put one end of it into the gunpowder. He made a flame and held it against the cloth. The piece of material began to burn. Dantes ran from the big rock and stood behind a smaller one. After a few seconds, the flame reached the gunpowder. It exploded with a loud bang. Dantes saw that the big rock had moved a few meters. It was now lying on some soft earth and small stones at the edge of a slope. Dantes pushed against the rock with all his strength. After a moment or two, the rock moved and began to roll down the slope. The rock rolled faster and faster until it fell into the sea. There was a flat, square stone where the rock had been lying. In the stone, there was a large metal ring. Dantes pulled on the ring and slowly lifted up the stone. It was a door. Below the door, there were some steps that went down under the ground. He had found the caves. Dantes went down the steps into the first cave. The air in the cave was cool and pleasant, and daylight came through a hole in the roof. He looked round the cave, but it was empty. Then he remembered the words in the letter. The treasure is in the corner of the second cave. Where was the second cave? He knocked on the walls of the cave with a pickaxe. In one place, the sound was different. Dantes hit the wall again, but this time he used the sharp end of the pickaxe. He hit the wall hard, and the rock fell away. Behind it, there were some square white stones. Dantes removed these quickly, and soon there was a big hole. When he climbed through the hole to the second cave, he saw that it was empty. Perhaps the treasure is buried in the corner under the floor, he thought. He walked across to the corner of the cave and began to dig. After a few minutes, he had removed many meters of earth and stones. Suddenly, his pickaxe hit something. He dug deeper. It was a wooden chest. Dantes dug the earth away until he could see all of the chest. On the top of it, there was a square of silver with a picture of a sword. Faria had told Dantes that this was the mark of the Spadas. Dantes opened the lid of the chest with a pickaxe. Inside, there was a wonderful treasure. Gold coins, silver, and very many jewels of all kinds. Dantes touched some of the coins and the jewels. Was he awake, or was it a dream? He laughed and danced round the cave. Then he fell onto his knees and thanked God. The next day, Dantes began to think more calmly. He filled his pockets with coins and jewels. Then he put the chest back into the hole in the floor. He covered the hole with some earth and stones and walked back through the caves. He shut the stone door at the top of the steps. Then he covered the door with earth and stones, and he planted some small bushes in the earth. Next, he took a branch from a tree and carefully removed all his footmarks. 6 days later, the Jeune Amélie returned to Monte Cristo. Jacopo and 3 other men rowed a longboat to the shore. Dantes told the smugglers that he felt much better. When the Jeune Amélie reached Leghorn, Dantes went to a jeweller's shop. He sold 4 of the smallest jewels from the treasure chest. The jeweller gave Dantes 20,000 francs for the jewels, and he asked no questions. The next day, Dantes bought a boat and went to speak to Jacopo. Dantes and Jacopo had become good friends. Dantes liked the Corsican, and he needed his help, but he did not tell the smuggler about the treasure. He gave the boat to Jacopo and asked him to sail it to Marseille. Then he gave Jacopo some gold coins. "Take this money to pay a crew," he said. Jacopo was very surprised. "My uncle has died and left me a lot of money," said Dantes. "I won't have to work as a sailor any more." Then he told Jacopo that he knew how to get a lot more money. Jacopo was interested in this idea. He agreed to sail the boat to Marseille. "When you reach Marseille," said Dantes, "find out everything about an old man called Louis Dantes and a young woman called Mercedes." Dantes went to Captain Baldi and told him that he was leaving the Jeune Amélie. He gave presents to the captain and the crew and said goodbye. Then he went to buy a yacht. This little boat was small and fast, and Dantes could sail it alone. Dantes sailed first to Genoa and then to the island of Monte Cristo. When he reached Monte Cristo, Dantes went ashore and walked all around the island. There was no one there. He was alone. That night he slept for only a few hours. He was very excited. At sunrise, Dantes began to remove the treasure. He worked all through the day. By the evening, all the treasure was hidden in his yacht. For 7 days, Dantes watched the sea. He sailed slowly around the island. On the 8th day, he saw the sails of Jacopo's boat. Soon he was anchored beside it. Jacopo told him the sad news that he had heard in Marseille. Old Louis Dantes was dead, and Mercedes had disappeared. On a fine day, a few weeks later, Dantes arrived in the port of Marseille. "I can't use the name Edmond Dantes anymore," he thought. "People will be looking for Edmond Dantes. the prisoner who escaped from Chateau d'If. I want to stay a free man. A lucky chance and dear Faria have made me a rich man. Perhaps I can start a new life with a new name. I shall become the Count of Monte Cristo." He smiled. "I like it," he said. Now it was time to find his enemies and take revenge.
The Treasure of Monte Cristo by Alexander Dumas. Retold by John Escott. Published by Macmillan Heinemann ELT, a division of Macmillan Publishers Limited. Copyright Macmillan Publishers Limited, 2007.